Sarah Mitchell had always dreamed of flying. As a little girl growing up in Colorado, she would lie on her back in the grass and watch military jets streak across the blue sky, leaving white trails behind them. Her father, a retired Air Force pilot, would tell her stories about the freedom of being up there among the clouds. She listened with wide eyes, knowing that one day she would follow in his footsteps. But Sarah wanted more than just to fly. She wanted to serve her country in the most demanding way possible. After graduating from the Naval Academy at the top of her class, she did something that shocked everyone who knew her. Instead of going straight into aviation training, she applied for the Navy SEALs program. Her friends thought she was crazy. Her mother cried for weeks. Even her father, who had always supported her dreams, wondered if she was pushing herself too hard. The training was brutal beyond anything Sarah had imagined. The instructors tried to break her spirit during Hell Week, making her carry logs twice her weight and swim in freezing ocean water until her lips turned blue. Many of the men in her class dropped out, ringing the bell that signaled their defeat. But Sarah refused to quit. She thought about those jets flying overhead, about her father's stories, about proving that she belonged there. When other candidates were lying in their bunks groaning from exhaustion, Sarah was doing extra push-ups. After 2 years of the most intense military training in the world, Sarah earned her Trident pin. She was one of the first women to become a Navy SEAL, but she wasn't done yet. She immediately applied for aviation training, determined to combine her two passions. The Navy didn't know what to do with her. Nobody had ever been both a SEAL and a pilot before. They created a special program just for her, training her to fly the most advanced aircraft while maintaining her special operations skills. Sarah spent the next 5 years on secret missions around the world. She flew into hostile territories where no one else could go. She rescued hostages from impossible situations. She became a legend in the special operations community, though few people outside of it knew her name. Her call sign was Phoenix because she seemed to rise from impossible situations again and again. On a quiet Tuesday morning in September, Sarah was supposed to be on leave. She had just returned from a mission in the Middle East and was planning to visit her parents in Colorado. She was at the airport in civilian clothes, her hair down, looking like any other tired traveler. Nobody would have guessed that the woman standing in line at the coffee shop was one of the most highly trained warriors in the American military. She bought a cappuccino and a magazine, then headed toward her gate, thinking about her mother's home cooking and her father's workshop, where they would spend hours talking about aircraft engines. She had no idea that in less than 2 hours everything would change. The flight was supposed to be routine. Sarah settled into her seat in row 23 next to a window. She liked watching the ground fall away during takeoff, seeing the world become small and manageable from above. An elderly couple sat in the row in front of her, holding hands. A businessman across the aisle was already typing on his laptop. A mother with 2 small children struggled with bags and toys a few rows back. Sarah closed her eyes as the plane pushed back from the gate, feeling the familiar rumble of the engines. She thought about the week ahead, about rest and family and normal life. But Sarah Mitchell's life had never been normal, and today would prove that once again. As the plane climbed through the clouds, she noticed something that made her training kick in immediately. 2 men in different parts of the cabin were making eye contact and nodding to each other. Their body language was all wrong, and Sarah recognized the signs she had been trained to spot. Her vacation was about to be canceled in the most dramatic way possible. Sarah kept her eyes half closed, pretending to rest while watching the 2 men through her peripheral vision. One was sitting 5 rows ahead on the left side, a tall man with a beard wearing a dark jacket despite the warm cabin temperature. The other was near the back, thin and nervous, constantly checking his watch. They were communicating without speaking, using small gestures that most passengers would never notice. But Sarah had been trained to notice everything. Her heart rate stayed calm and steady. Years of training had taught her to control her body's response to stress. While adrenaline flooded through her system, her breathing remained slow and even. She thought through her options carefully. She couldn't be sure they were planning something, but every instinct told her something was wrong. The way they positioned themselves gave them visual control of the entire cabin. The way they kept checking the cockpit door. The way the man in front reached into his jacket pocket and held something there, not pulling it out but keeping his hand on it. Sarah glanced around the cabin without moving her head much. The flight attendants were busy serving drinks and snacks, unaware of any danger. The captain had just announced they had reached cruising altitude. Most passengers were settling in, opening books or putting on headphones. The elderly couple was asleep. The businessman was still working. The mother was trying to keep her children entertained with coloring books. All these innocent people had no idea they might be in danger. Making a decision, Sarah pressed the call button above her seat. A flight attendant came over, smiling professionally. Sarah leaned in close and spoke very quietly, her voice calm but urgent. She identified herself as military and explained what she had observed. The flight attendant's smile faltered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly and nodded. She walked away casually, heading toward the front of the plane to inform the captain. 3 minutes later, the bearded man stood up and started walking toward the cockpit. His hand was now clearly gripping something in his jacket. At the same moment, the thin man in the back stood as well, reaching into his bag. Sarah saw it all happening in slow motion. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her movements smooth and controlled. Other passengers looked at her curiously, wondering why someone was standing when the seatbelt sign was still on. The bearded man pulled out a knife and grabbed a flight attendant by the arm, pulling her in front of him as a shield. People started screaming. Children cried. The man shouted that everyone should stay in their seats or he would hurt the flight attendant. His partner in the back pulled out another knife and yelled similar threats. They had practiced this, Sarah could tell. They knew exactly what they were doing, but they didn't know about Sarah Mitchell. As the bearded man dragged the flight attendant toward the cockpit door, Sarah moved. She had crossed half the distance before anyone realized she was coming. The man saw her at the last second and raised his knife toward her, his eyes wide with surprise that someone was actually approaching him, instead of cowering in fear like he expected. That moment of surprise was all Sarah needed. Her training took over completely. She grabbed his knife hand with both of hers, twisting it sharply to the side. The knife clattered to the floor. Before he could react, she swept his legs out from under him and he went down hard. The flight attendant scrambled away to safety. Other passengers were frozen in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. This ordinary-looking woman in jeans and a sweater had just taken down an armed hijacker in seconds. But Sarah didn't have time to celebrate. The second hijacker was moving forward now, shouting angrily, his knife raised. Sarah positioned herself between him and the cockpit door, her stance balanced and ready. She could see in his eyes that he was more dangerous than the first man. He was trained too, she realized. This wasn't just a simple hijacking. These men had military training, probably from a terrorist organization. The thin man came at her with his knife, and Sarah knew this fight would be much harder than the first one. The passengers held their breath as the two opponents faced each other in the narrow airplane aisle, 30,000 feet above the ground with nowhere to run. The thin man lunged at Sarah with surprising speed, his knife aimed at her chest. She sidestepped, letting him pass by her, and struck him hard in the kidney as he went past. He grunted in pain but recovered quickly, spinning to face her again. Sarah could see respect mixed with hatred in his eyes now. He realized she was no ordinary passenger. The fight moved down the aisle as passengers pressed themselves back into their seats, trying to stay out of the way. The man slashed at her again and again, but Sarah used the narrow space to her advantage. In the confined area of the airplane, his movements were restricted while her training had prepared her to fight in exactly these conditions. She blocked his strikes, deflected his attacks, and slowly wore him down. Behind them, the first hijacker was starting to get up, blood running from his nose. Sarah knew she couldn't fight both of them at once in this confined space. She needed to end this quickly. The thin man made a mistake, overextending on a thrust, and Sarah saw her opening. She caught his wrist, pulled him forward off balance, and delivered a precise strike to his throat. He dropped the knife and fell to his knees, gasping for air. The bearded man charged at her from behind, but Sarah heard his heavy footsteps on the airplane floor. She spun and caught him with an elbow to the face, sending him stumbling backward into a row of seats. Before he could recover, several male passengers found their courage and jumped on him, holding him down. They had seen what Sarah could do and knew it was safe to help now. Sarah stood in the aisle, breathing heavily, her eyes scanning for any other threats. The two hijackers were subdued, passengers holding them down while flight attendants brought zip ties from the emergency supplies. But Sarah's training told her something was still wrong. Two men with knives didn't make sense for this kind of operation. There had to be more to the plan. She walked quickly to where the hijackers had been sitting and searched their belongings. In the bearded man's carry-on bag, she found what she was looking for and her blood ran cold. It was a sophisticated electronic device connected to several wires. Sarah recognized it immediately from her training. It was a remote detonator. These men weren't trying to take over the plane with knives. They were planning to blow it up. Sarah carefully lifted the device, her hands steady despite the situation. She called for the flight attendants and explained what she had found. The senior flight attendant went pale but maintained her composure. She used the intercom to inform the captain, who immediately declared an emergency and began looking for the nearest airport to land. But Sarah knew they might not have time. If there was a bomb on board, it could be set to detonate at a specific time or altitude. She examined the detonator closely, her training in explosives disposal coming back to her. The device had a timer and her heart sank when she saw it. They had less than 30 minutes before it would send the signal to explode whatever bomb was hidden on the plane. She called out to all the passengers and flight attendants, explaining the situation calmly but urgently. They needed to search the entire aircraft for the explosive device. At first, people were paralyzed with fear. The elderly woman started crying. The mother held her children close. But Sarah's calm confidence gave them courage. She organized them into teams, assigning each group a section of the plane to search. They looked everywhere. Under seats and overhead bins, in the bathrooms, in the galleys. The flight attendants checked the cargo hold through a small access panel. Time was ticking away. 20 minutes left. Then 15. Passengers were starting to panic again. Some were calling their families on their phones, saying goodbye. Sarah refused to give up. She closed her eyes and thought like a terrorist. Where would she hide a bomb if she wanted to bring down an airplane? Then it hit her. She ran to the back of the plane, to the last bathroom. It was the one place people avoided because of the smell and because it was furthest from most seats. She opened the door and immediately saw it. Behind the toilet, tucked into the maintenance panel, was a package wrapped in duct tape with wires sticking out. Sarah carefully pulled it free and saw the bomb. It was crude but effective, with enough explosive to tear the plane apart. The detonator in her pocket showed 10 minutes remaining. Sarah carried the bomb carefully to the front of the plane. Passengers watched in terrified silence as she held their death in her hands. She went to the cockpit door and knocked. The captain had been informed about who she was and opened it immediately. Sarah explained the situation. They were still 20 minutes from the nearest airport. The bomb would explode in 10 minutes. Sarah looked at the captain, then looked out the cockpit window at the mountains and forest below. She knew what she had to do, and the captain could see it in her eyes. Sarah asked the captain if there was any way to disarm the bomb. He shook his head. It was too sophisticated, with anti-tamper mechanisms that would trigger an explosion if anyone tried to disconnect the wires. They couldn't throw it out a window, because commercial aircraft windows don't open, and trying to blow open an exit door at this altitude would cause rapid decompression that could kill everyone. There was only one option that Sarah could see. She turned to the captain and told him she needed to take control of the aircraft. He stared at her in disbelief. She explained quickly. She was a trained pilot, one of the best in the Navy. She could take the plane down low and slow enough to safely throw the bomb out when they opened a door. The captain hesitated, but the co-pilot had been listening and recognized Sarah's name. He had heard stories about the legendary SEAL Aviator. He vouched for her. The captain made a decision that went against every regulation in the book. He unbuckled and moved aside, letting Sarah take his seat. She strapped in and put her hands on the controls, feeling the familiar weight of the aircraft through the yoke. But this was different from the military jets she usually flew. This was a commercial airliner with hundreds of innocent people depending on her. Sarah immediately began descending, bringing the plane down from 30,000 feet. She needed to get low enough that opening a door wouldn't cause catastrophic decompression. She explained her plan over the intercom to the terrified passengers. They needed to get to 2,000 feet. At that altitude, she could depressurize the cabin slowly and safely, then open the rear door just long enough to throw out the bomb. The plane dropped through the clouds. 5 minutes left on the timer. Sarah's hands moved confidently over the controls, making minute adjustments. She had the co-pilot contact air traffic control, explaining the emergency. Controllers cleared all other aircraft from their path and alerted emergency services on the ground in case something went wrong. Sarah could hear the fear in the co-pilot's voice as he talked to the tower. but she remained completely calm. 3 minutes left. They passed through 10,000 feet. Sarah continued the descent, faster than normal, but not so fast that it would stress the airframe or make passengers sick. She called back to the flight attendants, telling them to prepare the rear exit. She needed volunteers who were strong enough to help throw the bomb clear of the aircraft. Several male passengers stepped forward, including the businessman who had been working on his laptop and a young man who said he had been in the army. 2 minutes left. They dropped below 5,000 feet. Sarah could see individual trees now, rivers and roads. The altimeter spun downward. 4,000 feet. 3,000. The cabin pressure began to equalize naturally as they descended. Sarah told everyone to hold on to something when they opened the door. The rush of air would be powerful. 1 minute left. Sarah leveled off at 2,000 feet, flying over a remote forest area where the explosion would hurt no one. She gave the signal to the flight attendants. They moved to the rear door with the volunteers. Sarah held the plane as steady as possible, fighting the wind and turbulence at this low altitude. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her hands never shook. 30 seconds. The flight attendants armed the emergency exit. The door cracked open and wind roared into the cabin. Papers flew everywhere. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Passengers held on tight to their armrests, their seatbelts, anything they could grip. The volunteers grabbed the bomb carefully and moved toward the open door. The Army veteran held it, his hands shaking while the others held onto him. 20 seconds. Sarah maintained altitude and airspeed, giving them a stable platform. Through the cockpit door, she could hear the screaming wind. The timer in her pocket was counting down. 15 seconds. She called back to them to throw it now. The Army veteran pulled his arm back and hurled the bomb out into the empty sky. The flight attendants immediately began closing the door. 10 seconds. The door was stuck. Something was jamming it. The wind was too strong and it wouldn't shut completely. Sarah made a split-second decision and banked the plane slightly, changing the angle of the wind. The maneuver worked. The door slammed shut just as the timer hit 0. Through the cockpit window, Sarah saw a bright flash in the forest behind them. The bomb had exploded in mid-air, far enough away that the shockwave barely rocked the plane. Sarah pulled back on the yoke, climbing again, putting distance between them and the explosion. In the cabin, passengers were crying with relief, hugging each other, thanking God they were alive. The flight attendants secured the door properly and checked for injuries. Miraculously, everyone was okay, except for a few cuts and bruises from holding on during the maneuver. Sarah's hands finally began to shake now that the immediate danger had passed, but she kept flying, bringing the plane back up to a safe altitude and heading toward the nearest airport where police and FBI agents would be waiting. The airport was 30 miles away when Sarah got back on the intercom. Her voice was tired but steady as she addressed the passengers. She apologized for the rough ride and thanked them for their courage and cooperation. Without their help searching for the bomb and assisting with the emergency procedure, none of them would have survived. She told them they should all be proud of how they handled an impossible situation. The co-pilot took back the controls so Sarah could rest, but she couldn't sit still. She went back into the cabin to check on everyone. Passengers looked at her with awe and gratitude. The elderly woman grabbed her hand and kissed it, tears streaming down her face. The mother with the 2 children hugged Sarah tightly, unable to find words to express her thanks. Even the businessman, who had seemed so detached earlier, shook her hand with tears in his eyes. The 2 hijackers were secured in the back row, zip-tied and watched by several passengers who had volunteered to guard them. Sarah approached them, wanting to understand who they were and who had sent them. The bearded man spat at her and cursed in a language she recognized from her missions overseas. The thin man just stared at her with pure hatred. They weren't going to talk, but Sarah knew the FBI would eventually get information from them. As Sarah walked back toward the cockpit, the Army veteran who had thrown the bomb stopped her. He had recognized some of her techniques during the fight. He asked if she was military. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She wasn't supposed to talk about her service, especially her SEAL training, but these people deserved to know who had saved them. The veteran smiled and saluted her. Other passengers who overheard began to understand. The woman who had defeated armed terrorists and then piloted their plane to safety wasn't just lucky or brave. She was one of the most highly trained warriors in the world. The plane landed smoothly 20 minutes later. Emergency vehicles surrounded them on the runway, lights flashing. FBI agents boarded immediately and took the hijackers into custody. Paramedics checked everyone for injuries. News helicopters circled overhead, though no one had released any information yet about what had happened. Sarah tried to stay out of sight, knowing that her identity needed to remain secret for her future missions. But the passengers wouldn't let her disappear. They gathered around her on the tarmac, wanting to thank her properly. The elderly couple told her they were going to visit their grandchildren and now they would actually get to see them because of her. The mother's children drew pictures for Sarah with crayons, showing her as a superhero with a cape. The businessman wrote down his information and told Sarah if she ever needed anything at all, he would help her. FBI agents needed statements from everyone, especially Sarah. She spent 3 hours in a private room at the airport explaining everything that had happened. The agents were amazed by her quick thinking and her skills. They told her the bomb would definitely have destroyed the aircraft if it had detonated on board. Her actions had saved 287 lives, including the crew. They wanted to give her a medal, to hold a press conference, to tell the world what she had done. Sarah refused all of it. She explained that publicity would end her career in special operations. The terrorists would know who she was and would target her or use her face in propaganda. She asked them to keep her identity classified. The FBI director himself called and tried to persuade her to accept recognition, but Sarah was firm. She had done her duty. That was enough. Finally, they agreed, though they told her the story would still come out, just without her name or photo. The passengers were told not to share her identity, and most respected that request, though some details inevitably leaked out. News reports talked about a mysterious female military member who had saved the flight. Speculation ran wild on social media. Some people didn't believe the story, thinking it was too incredible to be true. Others hailed the unknown woman as a hero. Sarah ignored all of it. What she couldn't ignore was the call from her commanding officer. The Navy wanted to debrief her immediately. She flew to Washington that same night, still wearing the same jeans and sweater from the flight, now torn and stained. At the Pentagon, admirals and generals listened to her report. They asked detailed questions about the hijackers' training and equipment. Sarah's observations would help them prevent future attacks. When the debriefing ended, the Chief of Naval Operations personally shook her hand. He told her she had embodied everything the SEALs stood for: honor, courage, and commitment. She had proven that the investment in training female special operators was worth every penny, and then some. Sarah felt proud but also exhausted. She just wanted to go home and see her parents, to complete the vacation that had been so violently interrupted. 2 days later, Sarah finally made it to Colorado. She rented a car and drove up the mountain road to her parents' house, the same route she had taken 1,000 times growing up. The trees were changing colors, brilliant reds and golds against the deep blue sky. She felt like she could breathe properly for the first time since the hijacking. The adrenaline had finally worn off, leaving her tired but at peace. Her father was in his workshop when she arrived, working on restoring an old propeller from a World War II aircraft. He looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, and his face broke into a huge smile. He hugged her tightly, not saying anything for a long moment. Her mother came running from the house, tears already streaming down her face. They held her between them, and Sarah felt like a little girl again, safe and protected. Over dinner that night, Sarah told them everything. Her parents listened in amazement and horror as she described the hijacking, the fight, finding the bomb and flying the plane to safety. Her father kept shaking his head in disbelief. Her mother held Sarah's hand across the table, squeezing it whenever the story got particularly dangerous. When Sarah finished, her father said he had always known she was destined for something special, but this exceeded even his wildest imagination. The next few days were quiet and healing. Sarah helped her father in the workshop just like old times. They didn't talk much, just worked side by side, the smell of oil and metal shavings filling the air. Her mother cooked all of Sarah's favorite meals. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and orange. Sarah felt the tension slowly leaving her body, The constant readiness that special operations required gradually relaxing, but she couldn't completely let go. One afternoon, Sarah received an encrypted message on her phone. It was from intelligence analysts who had interrogated the hijackers. They had uncovered a larger plot. The two men on the plane were part of a terrorist cell planning multiple attacks. The information Sarah had provided by observing their techniques and examining their equipment had led to raids that stopped other attacks and saved countless more lives. The analysts thanked her, saying she had done more than save one airplane. She had helped dismantle an entire terrorist network. Sarah also heard from many of the passengers through carefully managed channels. They sent letters through the FBI protecting her identity. The elderly couple wrote that they had enjoyed a wonderful week with their grandchildren and thought of Sarah every day. The mother sent photos of her children, who were doing well and had no trauma from the experience because Sarah had kept them safe. The Army veteran wrote that she had inspired him to re-enlist and serve his country again. Each letter meant more to Sarah than any medal could have. The businessman kept his promise to help. When he learned through his FBI contact that Sarah's parents' house needed a new roof, he anonymously paid for it. When he found out Sarah had been donating her salary to veterans' charities, he matched her donations tenfold. He never asked for recognition or even confirmation that Sarah knew what he was doing. He just wanted to repay the debt he owed to the woman who saved his life. After a week in Colorado, Sarah received orders for her next assignment. It was classified naturally, somewhere she couldn't tell her parents about. The night before she left, her father took her back to the workshop. He showed her something he had been working on in secret. It was a small wooden propeller, beautifully carved and polished, mounted on a base with a brass plate. The plate was engraved with a quote from Amelia Earhart about courage and flying. Her father said it was to remind her of who she was and what she was capable of, even when the world couldn't know her name. Sarah cried then, for the first time since the hijacking. Not from fear or stress, but from gratitude and love. She had been given the greatest gift anyone could receive. She had been able to use her skills and training to save innocent lives. She had proven that the years of grueling preparation were worth it. She had shown that women could serve at the highest levels of military excellence, and she had done it all while remaining true to herself and her values. The next morning, Sarah drove back down the mountain. In her rearview mirror, she could see her parents standing on the porch waving goodbye. She would miss them, but she knew they understood. This was who she was meant to be. A warrior, a pilot, a protector, someone who stepped forward when others stepped back, someone who could look at an impossible situation and find a way through it. 3 months later, the investigation into the hijacking was complete. The FBI held a press conference announcing that they had disrupted a major terrorist plot. They credited an unnamed military member with saving Flight 447 and providing crucial intelligence. The passengers were interviewed by news stations, and they spoke glowingly about the mysterious woman who had saved them, careful not to reveal any identifying details. The story captured the nation's imagination. People debated who she might be, where she came from, what made her so capable. Sarah watched the coverage from a secure location overseas, preparing for another mission. She smiled at the speculation and the praise, but it all felt distant. What mattered to her was that everyone on that plane had gone home to their families. The children were safe. The elderly couple had seen their grandchildren. The businessman had returned to his company. And she had proven to herself that all the sacrifice, all the training, all the long nights and dangerous missions were for a purpose. She thought about that little girl lying in the grass in Colorado, watching jets fly overhead and dreaming of serving her country. That girl would have been proud of the woman Sarah had become. A Navy SEAL and an aviator, combining two impossible dreams into one extraordinary career. Someone who could fight terrorists in hand-to-hand combat, defuse a bomb and fly a damaged aircraft to safety all in the same day. Someone who represented the very best of what Americans could be when they dedicated themselves completely to protecting others. Sarah stood up from her computer and walked outside into the desert night. Somewhere above her, jets were flying, leaving contrails across the stars. She watched them for a moment, remembering. Then she turned and walked back inside. There was work to do, missions to plan, training to complete, because somewhere out there, people she would never meet were counting on her to be ready when they needed her most. And Sarah Mitchell, the SEAL aviator who saved Flight 447, would always be ready to step forward and do what needed to be done, whether anyone ever knew her name or not.